Edition of the House Water Committee. Our first item is a request for bill introductions. Representative Howerton.
Good morning, committee. I'd like to ask for RS 2915 to be introduced. The last committee, we had a couple of questions concerning two words, advise and assist. I looked at the GMD2 Act, and the chief engineers mentioned 90 times in that act. All of them are specifically related to GMD2s and how they are supposed to, in relation to how they are supposed to act. And so I just want to ask this committee to have a hearing so that we can look at these questions. Do we need to bring clarity to Section M of KSA 828-1028, where the advise and assist is? Because it's very vague in that little section as to who they are to advise and assist. So I'm just asking that we have a hearing on that to see if we need clarity, to see what advise and assist really means in relation to the GMD and the chief engineer, and then how do we define these words, and just a hearty discussion is what I'm asking for, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Are there any objections? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other introductions? Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to request two RS numbers. The first is RS 2824, and that clarifies the role of groundwater management districts in relation to water conservation areas and the approval of those. And then the second is RS 28, or should we approve one first before the other? Or? Okay. The second is RS 2823, and that would allow a required number of eligible voters to petition the chief engineer directly in order to leave a groundwater management district.
Are there any objections to those two introductions? Seeing none, are there any other bill introductions? Mr. Stuckey.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Randy Stuckey, on behalf of Groundwater Management District 5 this morning, would request introduction of RS 2825 regarding the Kansas water banking law. Thank you.
Are there any objections? Seeing none, let's introduce. Any further bill introductions? Seeing none, we'll move on to a hearing on House Bill 2459. And we'll ask Chris to explain this to us at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee. House Bill 2459 would prohibit the change of a point of diversion of water right if such change causes the safe yield of the source of water supply to be exceeded. House Bill 2459 amends the Kansas Water Appropriation Act, which starts at KSA 82A-701. The act provides for the issuance of permits to appropriate the beneficial use of water and for the regulation of those water rights. KSA 82A-701 provides definitions that are used throughout the act, and KSA 82A-708B provides procedures for water right owners to apply to the chief engineer to change the place of use, point of diversion, or usage of the water right without losing such rights priority. To make such proposed change, a water right owner must apply in writing to the chief engineer, demonstrate to the chief engineer that any proposed change is reasonable and does not impair existing rights, and demonstrate that any proposed change relates to the same water supply source and water right. And then they must receive approval by the chief engineer before making the proposed change. What the bill would do is add a new definition to the Water Appropriation Act for safe yield. And safe yield would be defined as the long-term sustainable yield of the source of water supply, including hydraulically connected surface water or groundwater. The bill would also amend 82A-708B regarding applications to change the point of diversion. And it adds an additional requirement for those changes that they must not also cause the safe yield of the source of water supply to be exceeded. This is a holdover bill from last session, so any references to dates would need to be updated if the bill passes out of committee and the bill becomes effective upon publication in the statute book. That I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Representative Blex.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation. I'm assuming long-term, definition of long-term is indefinite.
Yeah, safe yield is a term used in the regulations, so I think its calculation division might already have or might develop through rules and regs, but yeah, long-term it's a fairly broad term.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you, Chris. Okay, we will, I need to inform the committee, the sheet in your folder today, we have one addition. Lance Nelson, past president of the Kansas Grain and Feed, will also give in-person testimony, and I believe that's last in line. Are there any proponents? Seeing none. We have several neutral in person, and we would call on Lane Letourneau. Thank you, Lane.
Good morning, committee. I'm Lane Letourneau, the Water Appropriation Program Manager for the Kansas Department of Agriculture's Division of Water Resources. And we stand here today neutral on this bill because we understand basically the concern that's out there. And as written, as explained, a new location of a water right, that well, if someone filed a change application, that new location would have to meet safe yield. And last year, when this was introduced, we had heard that this was coined the Stop Chasing Water bill. And so what we hear in mostly the Ogallala Aquifer in southwest Kansas is that a person will dewater their current location. They'll pump away the storage, and that well is can no longer irrigate. So a person will file a change application and potentially move that point of diversion up to a half mile into a deeper part of the aquifer. And we'll hear from those folks in that new location is like, hey, these guys are moving closer to us. And all that stuff meets the rules right now if we have wells, if they meet well spacing, and if we don't see a big impact to the folks that are currently in that new location, then that change application will be approved. And so we do have folks that are creeping into the deeper parts of the aquifer. And as currently written, this bill does effectively stop chasing water. We are not aware of any location in the Ogallala Aquifer that meets safe yield because it was developed on what was started out as allowable appropriation and then planned depletion. Folks knew as they developed the Ogallala that it was being depleted. This also stops the practice of an individual that will get a new application approved in an undesirable location, maybe where there'll be some salt water or something, so there's nothing there, no development. They'll get a new application approved in that undesirable location, and they will complete a half-hearted well, I'll call it. The well's complete, it meets the rules, but then once they develop a little bit at that undesirable location, then they will file a change application then to move it to the more desirable location that did not meet safe yield in the first place. And so that practice, there's a handful of those, and this would stop that practice. And then the biggest concern to us is this bill stops what we call 300-foot moves, short move changes, or emergency redrills. there are a number of folks out there that their well will collapse, it starts pumping sand, the pump gets stuck or whatever. We will, folks will come into our field offices and file what we call a short move change, less than 300 feet, and then drill so they can keep operating their water right. And like I said, in the Ogallala, that would not take place based on how this bill is written. And so just quickly, for example, we looked at numbers from 2020 to present, and we approved 1,967 change applications and changes in point of diversion. 1,462 of those were in the High Plains Aquifer. But 550 of those moves were greater than 300 feet. So 1,100 applications were the short move changes that those folks needed to do for emergency redrills. And then, but total in all of statewide, 1,417 moves were less than 300 feet. So with that, I'll stop and answer questions. And I really appreciate this, and it's good to see everybody. So.
Are there any questions? Representative Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Letourneau, good to see you. What's the maximum distance somebody can move a point of diversion currently?
Right now, it is a half mile.
And how is that distance determined?
David Pope, I visited with the former chief engineer about that, and in the statute, it's local source of supply. You cannot, you've got to stay within the local source of supply of the original water right. But when you run the TICE analysis, you get in an unconfined aquifer. Jim Bagley, who's retired now, is a genius at that type of evaluation. In a growing season or 3 months, that well, the cone of depression of that well would reach out a quarter mile. And so at the time, I remember GMD5 had a rule that was a quarter mile and things. So when I visited with, we get a lot, well, you need to define the local source of supply and things, but when I visited with Chief Engineer David Pope at the time, he said, well, he thought that the local source of supply, while it was a quarter mile in a year, over multiple years, he allowed that to go out to a half a mile because he wanted the aquifer to be fully developed, is how he put it to me.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Seeing none, we'll move on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lane. Next is David Barfield, civil engineer.
In committee, it's a pleasure to be here. Glad I came after Lane. It'll shorten my comments because I was going to sort of cite the specific sort of types of concerns that I think are being addressed by the bill. I'm neutral because I think the bill is trying to solve some real problems here. Again, I've got similar concerns to others I think you'll hear from in terms of the specifics of the language and in particular the putting some of these things in statute prevents the chief engineer from exercising discretion. You know, the Kansas Water Appropriation is a very good act, and the implementation through regulations that's allowed under the act of the chief engineer. We have a body of water law in our state that I think is among the best in the West. One of the things that you need to recognize, I guess, is you write statute if there's a situation where that language doesn't fit, the chief engineer does not have discretion to waive a statute. Where there's problems that are addressed in regulation and there's a specific situation, the chief engineer has discretion if it's in the public interest, if it won't impair other water rights and so forth, that he can waive the specific regulations that are, again, a big part of the body of our water law. So just backing up, so the reason I'm coming here, I guess, and addressing comments I think that are fairly similar to Lane's is we have real problems. Chasing water is a real problem. Sometimes people move, they do multiple moves. They'll move half a mile and then they'll move another half a mile. And that's a real concern, especially out west. You've developed your water right in a specific location. You really ought to allowing people through multiple moves to sort of go to somebody else's place is a problem. So, and again, Lane cited in areas that are still open to new appropriations and governed by safe yield, sort of allowing them to find a spot and then move again is a real concern. So the big, I do consulting now that I'm retired from the division as chief engineer in 2020. My consulting practices includes a number of cities. Cities have real challenges. You can't move a city. You got to find water, and a number of cities are finding increasing problems with like nitrate contamination or new contaminants like PFAS being found, so that the aquifer they developed in and have used for decades is no longer viable. They need to move. So they often need more flexibility, not less flexibility. So I'm quite concerned about putting in statute provisions that prevent them and the chief engineer from finding real solutions. So again, because the chief engineer, if you put it in statute, he can outweigh that statute. So I'd urge you to sort of identify the real problems and really work with the chief engineer. Is this something you can fix through regulations? Is it something you need more statutory discretion in? Then again, I'm for solving problems, but when you have sort of different problems that are in very specific context, finding a statutory fix for that is a challenge. So that isn't going to create unintended consequences. So that's basically the heart of my testimony. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Any questions? Representative Getz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned the multiple moves. It just, any clarity on how much that has happened over the last 50 years? Has it happened 50 times, 1,000 times?
Well, I don't have numbers, but it's not thousands. I mean, it's not 1,000. It happens, but it's again, it's not extremely common. I don't believe.
Do you call it rare or?
I would say not uncommon, but that's mincing words. So
thank you. Appreciate it.
Any further questions? Representative Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barfield, kind of to my question to Mr. Letourneau, and his comment about wells dewatering and then moving potentially up to a half mile. Would you say part of the issue of this is that comes down to what do we mean by source of supply? And if you've dewatered an area and you have to move half a mile before you can reach water again, is that really the same source, or the saltwater example? Mm-hmm. Could you just, you've seen a lot of these applications in your former position, could you just maybe talk about that concept and if that's something that ought to be addressed?
Well, so again, the statutory language in terms of when a change application, I mean, the Water Appropriation Statute is a very important provision of the Water Appropriation Act to allow people to change their water rights. And as Lane indicated, there's a lot of need to move wells in particular. A well collapses, wells don't last indefinitely, and so anytime you drill a new well, that's a change because you can't put it right where the old well was. So changes are common. The statutory language says it must be reasonable, and it must not impair neighboring water rights, and it must be from the same local source of supply. So that's the statutory language. It's not source of supply, it's local. So I'm actually doing some work in Nevada right now, and they actually allow moves within an entire basin, which was shocking to me. But in Kansas, we have a very narrow view of moves. It's a hard concept to define. And again, different aquifers, that value may be different. In a confined aquifer setting, it might be larger than half a mile. So again, I think this is something that is best done in regulation through the chief engineer. I'm not sure if I answered your question. Close enough. Okay.
Any further questions? Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Barfield. This is just to take a quick step back, but for the sake of the committee, could you discuss the prevalence of chasing water generally? And I think, it's good context to have for this discussion and how this may be contributing to the decline of the aquifer. just as we kind of hear from all sides of the issue, but just generally in your experience as chief engineer, what was the prevalence of chasing water? Thank you.
So the multiple moves that I spoke about, I think are uncommon, rare. You know, moves happen, and I think as people, their well fails or needs to be re-drilled is inefficient. You know, when they do those moves, I think it's not uncommon, and it's probably more common to say, you know, try and move as far as you can toward a better, you know, more saturated thickness. So, that just happens quite a bit. So, and again, the chief engineer is working on developing a regulation. I actually included that in my testimony to help guide when can you move without injuring your neighboring water rights. And so again, the chief engineer's in the process, and he's getting a lot of input from various people to sort of help provide more direction to that. So,
thank you.
All right, any further questions? We'll move on. Thank you very much. Next to present, Josh Savati with the Kansas Municipal Utilities.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I am Joshua Swati here on behalf of the Kansas Municipal Utilities. We are the statewide association of all of the municipally owned electric, natural gas, and water and wastewater systems in the state of Kansas. I'm a little embarrassed. My entire expertise on this subject would fit into a thimble compared to David Barfield and Lane Letourneau, so it's tough to follow them. But I would say KMU is here today is neutral for the following reasons. First, if this legislation were to move forward, as has been expressed by the two previous speakers, municipals as well as other beneficial uses, but municipalities in particular have a very definite need for emergency reasons to have a redrill. So that does, as has been expressed before, occur from time to time. And as you can imagine, in the case of a supply of water for a community, it is mission critical to us to have the ability to have a redrill situation. And then there's also maybe non-emergency situations that would also be really important for us to have flexibility. So for sure, if this committee were to consider this legislation and move forward with it, we would have some recommended changes. The reason we are neutral, though, is that I think what you're seeing is the transition. If you can step back from this piece of legislation and just consider your role on this committee, it is transitioning over time from talking about water in terms of, well, we might run out someday, what can we do about it, to you are actually experiencing the kind of grinding of our statutory language and how interests collide as that water gets less and less in particular parts of the state. And so the municipal interests want to make sure that our voices are heard on this, because as aquifers decline and these aspects of the law that maybe have not been used as much in the past because there was more plentiful water become more used. We want to make sure that municipal interests are protected for those communities that are in that aquifer, because there is a substantial difference, or at least in our opinion, it is very important for us to be able to supply water to the individuals that live in those communities. And then certainly, and on other committees, you talk about the potential for growth in rural areas. If we want any opportunity to say our communities can grow in areas that are above an aquifer, we have to be able to supply future water for them as well. And so it is important for us to, as moves are made to find a greater saturated thickness, that it does not just accelerate the decline of the aquifer, particularly in areas where municipals are drawing their water as well to supply their communities. So we appreciate the conversation. Obviously, there would be changes that we would like to have made if we were to move forward. As has been expressed before, this is a very important tool for us, particularly in times of emergencies. But long term, I think it's important to have this discussion about slowing the decline of the aquifer, and that's why we came in neutral. Thank you. And I'd stand for questions.
Are there any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. We'll move on to our list of opponents in person today, and we will start with Kirk Hager with the Southwest Kansas Irrigation Association. Welcome.
Good morning, Chairman, Committee. I am Kirk Hager from Southwest Kansas, Stevens County, fourth-generation farmer and irrigator. I've been active in Kansas water management issues for over 30 years. I've served on statewide committees and task force. I've also been involved with the Southwest Kansas Groundwater Management and Southwest Kansas Irrigators. I come today to oppose House Bill 2459. I'm confused and concerned how this bill has made it this far. Anyone should see if this bill becomes law, it would be the end to accessing water supplies across the entire state. Is it an intent of this bill to deny a municipality in Kansas the ability to relocate a point of diversion, ultimately making that water supply unavailable? That's what this bill would do. I certainly hope it's not an intent, and we've heard some comments this morning that from these discussions comes a change in perspective in our water law. We are a priority of time state and not a priority of use. And we need to be very careful that we don't lose track of that in these discussions. We just, in part of the discussions we've had over time was the 50-year water vision that took about 4 or 5 years to develop. A lot of people in western Kansas across the state participated in that. The state agencies were very active. They built a lot of trust and a lot of confidence, and we don't want to see that trust and confidence diminished. One thing that came out of that, I think we should all remember, is locally driven solutions have the best chance of providing long-term solutions. After attending some of these committee meetings, I've reached a conclusion it is the objective of several legislators to control water management strategies outside of their legislative districts, without regard to the past efforts made by local stakeholders who are directly affected by those same strategies. We need to keep in mind that it needs to come from the grassroots up and not from the top down. So that attitude from some people leads me to believe that the investment made by property right owners and their lenders that was necessary to perfect that authorized use. We had to invest a lot of money to go out after the permits were granted to develop the use, perfect the use. That investment is not being recognized by several people. Throughout the period of recouping the investment, the property right holders are subject to failure of the diversion works. If a well collapses or otherwise becomes encumbered, the right has been available to re-drill that well and continue to the path of return. Several property right holders are in this position right now and will continue to be exposed. If this bill becomes law, the investment and the collateral used to secure that investment loses its value. The lenders lose collateral, the note is not adequately secure, and the local economy suffer. I need to understand the objective behind the introduction of this bill. Why was it introduced? As public policy crafters and lawmakers, you all have accepted a huge responsibility, and I thank you for that. Please consider all the consequences of bad policy and laws, and House Bill 2459 is a bad law. Thank you, and I'll stand for questions.
Any questions? Representative Howerton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
We haven't heard from your association that I know of, who you represent, Southwest Kansas Irrigation Association, so I appreciate you coming up here today.
I'll give a quick note about that. It was formed in 1956, and it was just essential in initiating the groundwater management districts, local people taking initiative to provide local input to advise and consent state agencies and the chief engineer. So we've been around a long time.
Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much, Mr. Hager. Next, we have Tom Taylor, a board member with GMD 5.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, committee. I'm Tom Taylor. I'm board president of GMD5, farmer and irrigator. I'm here on behalf of the GMD5 to provide opposition testimony to House Bill 2459. I'll give you a little background info on GMD5's area. Many of you have heard, so I'll keep it short and simple. We are not like the West and the Ogallagua. In fact, we are nearly sustainable at this moment. Recent studies by Kansas Geological Survey reported the aquifer within Big Bend is 1.6% of being sustainable based on historical pumping. It has been closed for appropriation now for over 25 years, and in our district, our wells are able to we're able to reach our authorized permits. We're not lacking of water in that manner. We're not searching for water, and we're not aware of anybody having that issue and trying to search for water. So we have a few issues with this bill. The first one, the big one for us, is the consequence of this is it would get rid of our Big Bend specific regulation KR 52518, which does allow in our area movements of water over long distances, provided they meet criteria of into a safe area. In many areas, they're required to, you can't move the full permit always. Sometimes you can, but in many areas you have to take a conservation factor into that. So there's a savings there to wherever they're moving to. And to this date, we've not been aware of any problems where water has been moved. And this is a big tool for us to help with the rattlesnake issue, to get water out of the sensitive areas of the Rattlesnake Creek area to move it away to safer areas, which will help with our Quivira issue. Another one that we've been hearing mentioned is water quality issues. It doesn't really take into consideration of water quality, specifically for municipalities who have taken advantage of this, either due to various factors, but in our area, nitrates have become some issues. And it also does not take the fact if there is a salt area for the irrigator to be able to move to a better freshwater quality even when there's plenty of adequate water. The other thing we're concerned with is in subsection E, and you've heard about this too, the short moves. Like many have mentioned already, well casings do collapse. Whatever happens, we're not chasing water. We just need to move a short distance so we can re-drill and carry on. And that would need to be clarified. If that's going to be abolished, that is a major issue for us. We feel like this bill is designed to stop chasing of water, but in our area, that's not our issue. And we would like to see GMD5 always to be looked at as not tied all with the western districts where there is massive decline. So we would like anything going forward to keep in mind, we think state regulation should be worked with the GMD5, with the locals to go forward with that. And we feel like this bill misses that in a significant way. We encourage the committee not to go further with this bill. We look forward to working with any committee, any state agency to help with issues, but we feel this one is not suited for us and our needs and our concerns, and I would stand for questions.
Any questions? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
Our next opponent in person is Miles Franz, landowner.
My name is Miles Franz. I'm a landowner and a business owner. I live in Kansas City, on the Kansas side. I own a farming operation down in Liberal, Kansas. It's a third-generation farming operation. I'm here representing myself, my tenant farmers, Chris Harper, Steve Harper, Ron Oliver, and Dale Stone Street, in opposition to the bill. I'm very concerned with the bill HB 2459 that is being discussed by the Water Committee. I'm particularly concerned with the catastrophic impact that it could have on every small town and county in the Southwest region. From Dodge City west to the Colorado border and from Dodge City south to the Oklahoma border, agriculture is anchored in those center pivot irrigation sprinklers. And the ability to maintain those locally and have the individuals making decisions locally around those irrigation sprinklers is paramount to the success and to how long they can sustain their farming operations. Putting those decisions in the hands of individuals that are hundreds of miles away is not a good idea, in my opinion. Further, it presents an issue where we don't connect the dots of all the impact areas that can take place when you look at how farming and agriculture impacts those local economies. If you look just in that southwest region, there are multiple beef processing plants. There are ethanol producing plants. Aside from the fact that they're a protein supplier to the rest of us in Kansas, all of those are all intertwined. It's one big ecosystem that is reliant on the farmers. And any impact that would reduce the amount of availability of water and of irrigation to those farmers, or in short story, not allow them the flexibility to re-drill a well that runs dry or pulls sand, would have a severe negative impact. Almost every farmer that I know has leveraged their current property, their land, and they've leveraged it so they can acquire additional land, so they can acquire equipment, and they've gone to the local banks and they've gotten notes and they're carrying notes and they're making their payments and they're cash flowing their businesses, all based on the anchor value of the land that they leveraged in order to do that. The moment that they get told they cannot re-drill a piece of, a single quarter, 160 acres, that land will drop in value from probably by 85 to 90%. That'll cause problems with cash flow, with debt service, lending ratios, and everything else because of that one instance. Aside from the fact that if it's an emergency situation, they'll probably lose the crop. So I wanted to just come here and reference again to support my tenant farmers as a landowner and say I'm against this bill. I'm very aware of all the benefits that small town farmers provide to those of us that live in big cities. I think quite often we don't come to their defense enough, and I'm here to do that. So I'd welcome any questions.
Any questions? Representative Titus?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Franz, appreciate you making the trip over today. I would point out one thing, that the decisions on change application are already made hundreds of miles away from the district, whether we pass this bill or not. Those are worked by DWR. So I understand what you're trying to say, but it's already out of all of our hands. I would just ask, just kind of to clarify, I think everyone that has an interest in this room understands the economic importance of water and the ag economy all across the state. Are you mostly, when you talk about flexibility, are you mostly concerned about, because obviously if this bill were to move forward, it needs at minimum a 300-foot exemption. That's the majority of wells. But are you more concerned about providing for that to continue production, or are you more concerned about that 500 subset of wells that is doing that longer move up to a half mile, or does that make a difference to you?
I think if I were to rank the two, I would be much more concerned about the short move. I know for us, for instance, we had to re-drill a well last year. It wasn't a depth issue. The well had been in place since probably 1980, and it rusted out, pulled sand, and we had to pull everything out and re-drill it.
Makes sense. I appreciate the perspective.
Yeah, and I think secondarily, yes, then you get more into the land evaluation if you need to move further than 300 feet.
Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next presenter, Jarvis Garrettson, a producer and member of Farm Bureau.
Good morning, committee. Chairman Minix, appreciate the opportunity to testify in opposition to House Bill 2459. I'm from Haskell County, Kansas. I'm a member of Kansas Farm Bureau. I serve on their water committee. I'm a member of the Southwest Kansas Irrigators Association, member of Groundwater Management District Number 3. I'm a fourth generation Haskell County farmer. My great-grandfather homesteaded in 1902. raising my family on the home quarter, raising my boys in the house their grandpa grew up in, their great-grandpa grew up in. My legacy is in Haskell County. To say water is near and dear, it's the truth. The neighbors to the north homesteaded in the late 1890s. My great-grandfather hauled water from their well for a year until he got his well drilled. We own a vested right, HS3. My family defended that right to impairment through the court system, the first time that that has happened in the state. We have invested what turned out to be way too much money for what it was. But we defended Kansas water law, and we found out if it was going to be upheld or not. And not only did it cost money, it cost points, if you will, with the neighbors. Finally, after 10, 12 years of that being gone, everybody's understood, and our motivation is about the water. But not only do we own a vested right, which is kind of super senior, if you will, we also own appropriated rights that are junior. So we have a combination of very senior, very junior. In our area, we are very highly developed. Haskell County is, if it's not the most developed county in the state, it's probably in the top 3. Lots of irrigation, lots of development, and without a doubt, water has declined and is declining. If this bill passes, as it has been said, wells fail. But I've also, and our spacings with our vested right was too tight. We won't go into that, but we've acquired some land that would increase the redrillable area of that vested right. Because of past ownership, we could not access that area. Now that we own the adjacent property, it's a redrillable area within the half-mile move. If this were to pass, we could not research, do a test hole to access that area, which would improve the spacing of the neighborhood wells. If this bill passes, it will be devastating to the western third of the state. Businesses that rely on redrills, test holes, the well drillers, will be devastating to those business owners. As it's been stated, if we can't redrill and our property value goes from, right now pick a number, but decrease by a minimum of 50%, maybe upwards of 80%, just based on going from irrigated to dry land rates, values, that would mean foreclosures because we have leveraged those water rights and that value. The Kansas water right is a private property right. I view it as a take of a private property right from the state if this bill were to pass. And it's not just about irrigation. As we've heard from municipalities, this is statewide. All users, all water right owners, irregardless of type of use, of beneficial use. It's not only irrigators, it's municipalities, it's industry. Water's the lifeblood of this state. And I agree, we want to extend the life of the aquifer. I think we as a state could come up with better ways to do that than to pass House Bill 2459. And with that, I'll stand for any questions.
Any questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Garrison.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Our next presenter, Titus Yeager, of a landowner And a producer, I believe. Is Titus here? Is he online? Okay, we'll move down to Ken Askren, Policy Director for the Kansas Farm Bureau.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Kent Askren, here representing the members of Kansas Farm Bureau in opposition of House Bill 2459. I won't reiterate much of what you've heard already, maybe just touch on a couple of points. You may or may not be aware that nearly all of the state is fully appropriated right now. What that means is if you filed a new application, they ran a safe yield analysis, in much of the state, you would not get approval because the safe yield cannot be met. So I don't want you to think this is just a Western Kansas issue. This is a statewide issue that we're talking about here. It's also not just a well situation. We're talking about surface water and groundwater. So pump sites, the water you drink right here in the Capitol comes from the Kansas River, pumped from a pump site along the Kansas River. If for some reason, and streams tend to meander, that point of diversion needed to be relocated, this bill would not allow that. So we need to be very careful what we're dealing with here. So how do we safely allow point of diversion changes? I think maybe that was the more salient issue here with this bill. Well, first of all, and as was pointed out by the reviser of the law, it's pretty clear right now on the guidelines that we are to follow. It needs to be reasonable. Certainly cannot impair. We have to be very careful that we don't lead to impairments by changing a point of diversion. One term that you really need to latch onto here is it needs to be from the same local source of supply. Sometimes you'll hear people intermingle local source of supply with source of supply, two very different issues. And we need to be sure that we're aware of what those issues stand for. Also, when we're applying these standards, these safeguards, we need to be sure that we're doing that not just with base water rights, but any permit that's issued out of the office of the chief engineer, be they terms, temporaries, or whatever. We have a very limited water supply. You're all aware of that. You've heard testimony for a couple, 3 years now on this. The safeguards that we put in, the flexibilities that we allow cannot be used to exasperate that. We have to be very careful that we don't follow that, and we need to understand what the law currently allows. I guess in closing, I would just say that, as Jarvis said very well, passage of this bill would be devastating to the state. And so I hope that you will take these comments to heart as you ponder that. So, Mr. Chairman, if there are questions, I would be happy to stand.
Any questions for Ken? Seeing none, thank you very much. Next, we have Mark Rude, the manager of GMD3.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Good to see you again. My name is Mark Rude, Executive Director of Southwest Kansas Groundwater Management District. And in opposition of this bill, for a number of reasons that have already been described or alluded to, you have my written testimony there. Really appreciate the dialogue, though, on the concept, because the concept really addresses some of the issues the board of GMD3 has struggled with for a long time. Terms like hopscotching, chasing water, and even Lane touched on the concept of local source of supply. Of course, local source of supply is one of the tests under this statutory provision for changing water rights. It's not defined anywhere. And of course, well spacing, how far you can move a well is something that's been defined in rule and reg. And it may be different, appropriately different in different areas of the state. And as Kent pointed out as well, this bill applies to surface water as well. So like our ditch companies out there in Southwest Kansas, and there are some pump sites as well, if Mother Nature does what she does and things change, you've got to adjust your access to that water supply accordingly. So we need the flexibility to be able to do that. Safe yield, well, Well, let me just touch another comment on local source of supply. We have, you know, good, bad, or indifferent. The chief engineer's allowed moves up to 26 miles. So it's not the half mile. Certainly under the rule, we said there's got to be the limit for some of the reasons that Lane described. We just can't have wells that are pumping from a regional aquifer in a region that's heavily developed to move around very much because the effects are there. Jarvis and his family's activities in Gerritsen Brothers versus American Warrior. There was a discussion about impairment. And that study the chief engineer found that wells further than a half mile were affecting his well. So again, site by site, as I said day before yesterday, the aquifer is hyper locally driven. I mean, it differs as you move around. And therefore the effects on the other water users change. So the analysis is important to do when a change is proposed so that there isn't an unreasonable effect on the neighbor. The Gerritsen Brothers versus American Warrior, since we've never defined impairment, that court defined impairment in a fearful way. It said no effect. Well, we operate in a community in southwest Kansas of effects. It's just, are we tolerating it? Are we sharing the resource, and are we sharing the effects? And are we doing it in a reasonable way? In fact, the test that was put in the 50s in the Water Appropriations Act said there can be an effect, it just can't be unreasonable, beyond a reasonable economic limit. And we haven't defined that term either, primarily because it's sort of site-specific. There's a number of other points we make in this testimony, concerns that if we adopted this policy, then the only way for people to access a water supply is under a term permit, 82A 708C, which presumably would not be bound by this provision. But that's not a good way to go either. There's a reason why we have characterized water rights as a real property right, gotten the right to use out in the public domain, or excuse me, the private domain. But this term permit approach, if we go too far that direction, we're not sure that's a very good policy idea either. But certainly the conversation is welcome, and certainly congratulate you on the work that you do in these discussions. This bill is bad bill, and we stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Questions? Seeing none? Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Next, we have Tim Bays, GMD 2, Manager and Director.
Good morning, Chairman Minix and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear in front of you today to oppose House Bill 2459. Beautiful morning this morning driving up and got to see the sunrise over the Flint Hills, so that's always a good time, and it's good to see you all. I saw you last week. So again, we stand in opposition. My name's Tim Bays. I'm the manager of the Equus Beds Groundwater Management District in Halstead. I want to touch on a couple things. I don't want to reiterate what a lot of folks have already said, and I know time's getting short, but for GMD2 specific, much like GMD5, we are mostly sustainable. There are some areas that are challenging, that have some water level declines, and as I discussed previously through last week, and some water quality issues. As far as this bill restricting, I'm just going to call them well moves, because that's really it's really sort of the main thing in GMD2. Although certainly there are some surface water permits, and groundwater pits is not a well, but those can be sometimes moved too if they haven't been developed yet. So a couple of things. I really want to talk about why people re-drill wells. And I think you've heard most of the time it's from well failure. That's just the nature of it. Most well moves are 20, 30 feet from the existing well. Obviously, this bill could be modified to include, to exempt the 300-foot move or less. But I think there's a bigger issue though, because wells are moved for other reasons in GMD2, and it's not to chase water. And if you read my testimony, I think I said almost never to chase water, because I think as I drove up here this morning, I was thinking, I think there was one that I can remember recently, and you could, I guess, on the surface call it chasing water, but in reality, He was on the edge in McPherson County, developed water right, an old water right, a very senior water right. So his really choices were either to move the well or file an impairment complaint because he just didn't have the water supply that he used to have. That's really, the main one, and I realize we've talked about maybe new permits where someone could get a new permit in a marginal area and then move it. I think that's easily solvable with a regulation change. It's got to be a perfected water right if you want to move it. Rather than drilling a well and then just moving it a year later, I think it's just got to be perfected. They have to prove that they can use that water beneficially before you could move it. I wanted to give you a couple of examples of other reasons wells are moved more than 300 feet. Some very recent ones come to mind. One of them is the McPherson Refinery, CHS Refinery McPherson, and I don't want to speak for them. I helped them recently file a change in point of diversion where they need to move a well really from one side of their facility to the other for water quality issues. They've got an oil field contamination not caused by them, sitting over to the east of them that's marching to the west, and they're starting to be impacted. So over time, they've been moving their wells from one side of their plant to their other or more away from that contamination. And I would submit to you that that's probably going to end up saving them some water because they have to treat that water. They need high quality water. They got to treat. You get reject when you got to treat water. If they can have a higher quality water, they're probably going to use less water. And they've taken other steps to reduce their water use. The second one, which is really dear to my heart, is the K-14 highway expansion or construction. It finished kind of from Nickerson up to Lyons. I say it's dear to my heart because my daughter goes to Sterling College. And it's much safer as me as a dad to see her driving on that highway compared to what the road used to look like. But that had some consequences when that highway was built. It cut through numerous irrigation center pivot fields. So those people had to move wells, actually drilled 2 wells instead of one on each side of the highway, ran the safe field on those, and none of those would have met safe field. And in fact, they actually had to move to more appropriated areas. So the alternative that would have been to maybe KDOT buy their entire quarter section, put them out of business on those farms, or allow those moves. And they were moves. One of them actually ended up being a little bit more than a half mile. Had to give a board waiver and a GMD or a DWR waiver. The other thing I want to talk about is cities. Ironically, I had a call yesterday from a city in our district that is looking for a place to move their municipal wells because they have nitrate issues. Well, moving a well 10 or 20 feet, even 300 feet for nitrate issues isn't going to get it done. And they want to do some test drilling, and we're going to run some evaluations, some spacing, even some safe field evaluations for them where they could possibly move within a half mile. And that would certainly constrain their ability to serve their city if they can't move that well or invest in a very expensive treatment, reverse osmosis treatment facility. Irrigation wells also are moved for water quality issues. I think when I was here last week, I had a question about some of our monitoring wells along Burmack Road. It's the road from Burton to McPherson. Why do we have this straight line of wells, monitoring wells between Burton and McPherson? And that's the Voschild oil field. And if you look at, if I would have showed you where the points of diversion, where the wells are, the irrigation wells, every one of those that were on the east side Burmack Road has gone as far west as they can. They're all butted up against Burmack Road because they have the Voschild oil field contamination off to the east. So they had to move. 300-foot move wouldn't have helped them. They would have been, again, out of business. I mean, that water is extremely salty. And I want to talk a little bit also about cities that buy irrigation water rights. There's a number of them. Again, I don't want to get into specifics. City of McPherson, the Board of Public Utilities, City of Wichita, they bought irrigation rights. They're in the Water Rights Conservation Program. They have the ability to reactivate them and use them if they want to. They have valid water rights. They're not using them. A lot of them were bought for conservation, but if they needed them, well, you're not going to re-drill that irrigation well in the middle of a quarter section. It's really hard to protect the wellhead from contamination. You're going to move it over to the road where the pipeline is. In fact, a couple of these now have housing developments where that irrigation well used to be. Well, the developer's not going to let them re-drill even 10 feet from that old well. They're going to have to move it over the road where the developer says we'll meet. So I wanted to point out those are real life examples of even wells that had to be moved more than 300 feet. And I want to talk just a little bit about why I believe this should be in regulation form rather than statute. and we know Division of Water Resources has a draft regulation out that addresses this, attempts to address this issue, I think, of chasing water. We have some comments for that when that time comes. But GMD2 has already has some regulations to deal with some of these issues we're talking about. And I think the biggest one is chasing water. I think Mark called hop sketching across the county. We've already restricted well moves to a half mile from originally authorized location. We've done that for, I think, as long as I've been there, as long as I can remember, so 30+ years. It's from originally authorized. People can't move a half mile and then 2 years later move another half mile. It's always been a half mile from originally authorized. And I think that's a pretty easy way to solve that if that's the issue. The other is we've already addressed parts of our district. If someone wants to move more than 300 feet, they do have to meet safe yield. That's in parts of Reno County and basically the Pretty Prairie to Partridge area. It has a thinner saturated thickness. We spread wells out farther there to prevent impairment. And I think, as I think someone had mentioned, we did not want people to file on the edge where it's marginal and then move a half mile into the better spot. So we already have that in regulation, and it works very well. People just can't go out there and drill a well a half mile from where they're authorized from unless they meet safe yield. And that seems to have taken really care of that issue. Now we need to look, is there other areas in our district where that needs to be addressed? Yeah, there probably is, and we're going to be evaluating that, see if there's any other areas that need to meet safe yield. But to have a blanket, both a blanket statute or a regulation where you have to meet safe yield to move more than 300 feet is just not attainable in our district and not wise. I think with that, I'm going to close. I don't want to spend too much more time, but in summary, obviously the district board of directors, as the timing worked out, they were able to review this. We had a board meeting shortly before we found out that this was coming out, and the board did vote to oppose House Bill 2459. And with that, I'll stand for questions. Thank you.
Questions? Seeing none. Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you, committee.
Next, we have Aaron Propelka, Vice President, Governmental Affairs, Kansas Livestock Association, or Jackie Garagiola in substitute.
It was already on, sorry. Yep, hi, I'm Erin, just kidding. Hi, I'm Jackie Garagiola, representing the Kansas Livestock Association and our roughly 5,700 members. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for allowing me to be here today in opposition of 2459. I won't belabor too many points. I think we've gone through probably some of the highlights of my testimony anyway. But I did feel it was important to maybe point out KLA policy on this issue. We do have specific policy that opposes legislation or state regulation that further restricts the movement of the point of diversion of a water right. And we also support regulations that allow producers to acquire water rights and to shift point of diversion. So obviously this bill was an issue for us and for our members based on that policy. Really, the reason that it's an issue, and we represent a number of dairies and feedlots, and I kind of wanted to represent maybe the stock water perspective here today and touch on that, is that we operate where there is a really concentrated area. And so due to the steady and sustained use at a low flow rate and centralized distribution systems, shifting points of diversion is incredibly important to efficiently operate those operations. Also, these livestock facilities, larger ones especially in western Kansas, tend to expand. And when they do that, they actually will look at irrigation water rights to the peripheral of the livestock operation, and those are often retired and then diverted or shifted to existing stock water wells or split between irrigation rights and stock water rights. And as many have said, in a lot of areas, due to over-appropriation, we've already exceeded safe yield, so those changes would not be allowed to happen in order for those operations to continue. And we don't want to start reducing headcount. There's much of that part of the state that relies on these operations, and we want to make sure that those operations can continue efficiently. And that's really our main concern today. So with that, I'd be happy to stand for questions, but really appreciate you allowing me to be here in front of you all today. Thanks.
Okay, I know you've been holding your tough questions for now. Any questions from the committee? Okay, seeing no questions. At this time, we'll have Lance Nelson, past president of the Kansas Grain and Feed Association.
Good morning, committee. I'm Lance Nelson. I'm employed with the Lion Sag and Grain in Greensburg, Kansas. I've worked for the company for 25 years. I'm the regional agronomy manager there. I also spent 15 years on the Kansas Agribusiness Retailers Association Board of Directors and spent 2 years as board chairman. Chairman Minix and the members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony opposing House Bill 2459. This testimony is submitted jointly on behalf of Kansas Agribusiness Retailers Association, which is known as KARA, and Kansas Grain and Feed Association, known as KGFA. KARA is a statewide agribusiness industry trade association comprising of over 700 member companies that supply inputs to Kansas farmers, including pesticides, herbicides, seed, fertilizer, fuel, and agronomic services. KGFA is a state association of grain receiving, storage, processing, and shipping industry in Kansas. With a membership exceeding 950 Kansas business locations, KGFA represents 99% of the commercially licensed grain storage in the state. Members of these organizations serve Kansas farmers that utilize groundwater to grow agricultural crops that are used to feed, fuel, and clothe the world. As we understand, the intent of House Bill 2459 is to amend the Kansas Water Appropriation Act by defining safe yield as the long-term sustainability yield of the source of the water supply. In an attempt to prohibit water users from chasing water to gain access to groundwater pools, the bill would prohibit changing the point of diversion for a water right if such change would cause the safe yield of the source of the water to be exceeded. While we understand the purpose of the bill, it unfortunately does not sufficiently account for the various groundwater levels and recharge rates that exist in the various regions of the state, nor does the bill take into consideration the different types of water use permits. As drafted, the bill is overly broad, and its passage would create numerous unintended consequences to the extent of removing many producers' rights to divert water following a change in point of diversion, regardless of the purpose of the change or the distance from the existing well. The purpose of House Bill 2459 could be better achieved through passage of agency regulation or regulations by the Kansas Department of Agriculture's Division of Conservation. Such regulations could be better address specific, unique situations and also allow for exceptions for good cause as determined by the chief engineer. We would commit to working with the agency in that regulatory process. Thank you for allowing us the opportunity to testify in opposition of House Bill 2459. We would respectfully request that the committee not take further action on this bill, but rather encourage the KDA to address any existing concerns that this bill is intended to remedy through agency regulations. With that, I would take any questions.
Any questions from the committee?
Thank you.
Thank you. I believe that is all of the in-person testimony we have today. I want to direct the committee's attention. We do not have any proponent written testimony. Under neutral testimony, we have some in your folder from Wendy Stark with the Kansas League of Municipalities. Under opponent written testimony, we have Patrick Jansen, president of the Water Pack Association, Shannon Kenyon, manager of GMD4, Shahira Stafford with the Kansas Cooperative Council, Katie Durham, the manager of GMD1, Taylor Williamson with Kansas Corn, Tyler Hands, a managing partner with Triangle H Farms, and Alex Orrell with the Kansas Bankers Association. Are there any comments from the committee? Representative Titus?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to say something since my name was on this obviously very popular bill. It's been interesting since this hearing got scheduled because I didn't realize how many of the people in my past job I'd worked with had my cell phone number and weren't afraid to reach out when they saw something. But you know, we have a very wise chairman who doesn't always listen to freshmen, and so he'll obviously make the right decision on the future of this bill and what it looks like in this committee. But you know, I just wanted to point out this bill was obviously written very restrictively, and I think as a committee member, I heard that the 300-foot move at a minimum was loud and clear. But I think we also, from the point of a lot of neutral and opponent testimony, and Mr. Askren's testimony for the most part illustrated this very well. There is a real issue here and a real conversation that needed to be had. The only thing that really was alarming to me about this conversation was that several people in their written testimony suggested this was too touchy of a subject to even talk about. And I think that's kind of a scary place to be when people react that way. But there are real issues out there that need to be discussed. I know we have good staff at DWR that are working on these things. And so I really appreciate everybody putting in the time and helping flesh out this issue a little bit. And it's an issue I hope that we can all continue to work on. So again, appreciate everybody and thank you.
Representative Bloom.
Chairman Minix, we've sat here for over a session, and we've heard how wonderful these GMDs are and what a wonderful job these irrigators have done. And now we're not listening to them. Their way of life is at stake, and we've offered them no solutions to this problem. Before we vote this bill out of committee, we need to at least talk about all the consequences this bill is going to cause, and we need to have some solutions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for your comments. I thought it was important that we have this discussion, and I really appreciate the people that have traveled a great distance to come here in person, and also those that sent in written testimony. We hear what you're saying loud and clear, and we're here to work with you. I really appreciate your interest in what I believe is one of the state's most vital resources, water. And we will continue to work on issues here, and I don't believe that we will talk about this much more. I believe that DWR is working on some rules and regs, which I encourage. And I think that we as a group, everybody in the audience, everybody on this side of the table here, and everybody in the state of Kansas can continue to work together on these issues. So I appreciate all the comments, and most of all, I want to thank all the people who came today to give us testimony and work on this issue. So thank you very much. Next week, we are going to hear two bills on Tuesday, I believe 2633 and 2634. One concerns municipal water utility certification, and I'm drawing a blank right now. But we will have the flexibility within Lima's and Iguca bill next Tuesday. I think that's an excellent opportunity to talk about flexibility to allow producers to pump when they need to during drought years and not be restricted somewhat. So we'll have a good discussion on that next Tuesday. Thursday at this time, we're planning on potentially working a couple bills there, of those two bills specifically. And today we had, four bills introduced that we need to work on. After today, we have 6 more meeting dates. And my intent is for this committee to wrap up things a week before turnaround. I'm sure there will be some other things come forward that we need to deal with. I want to give the committee members a little flexibility during that last week. After turnaround, after the 24th of February here, I intend to have further presentations. There will be a few bills coming over from the Senate. But I appreciate everybody's attendance here today, and thank you very much. We are adjourned.